The air at Belle Reve was a thick, suffocating blanket woven from 3 distinct threads: the cloying sweetness of magnolia blossoms, the damp, earthy smell of the Mississippi soil, and the ever-present acrid tang of fear. Samuel knew that third scent better than the other 2 combined. It clung to the rough-spun cotton of his shirt, settled in the back of his throat, and seasoned every meager meal he took. Belle Reve, they called it, a beautiful dream. From the river, the great white house with its soaring columns might have looked the part, a pristine jewel set against the emerald green of the endless cotton fields. But for the 150 souls who toiled under its shadow, it was a place of waking nightmares. Samuel was a strong young man, his muscles forged hard by years of swinging an axe in the cypress groves and hauling cotton bales under the punishing sun. He kept his head down, his eyes averted, and his mouth shut. That was the first rule of survival at Belle Reve. The second was to never, ever draw the attention of the master. And the third, the most important rule of all, whispered in the dark of the cabins from one generation to the next, was to stay clear of the kennels. Master Tiberius Beaumont was a man of contrasts. To the visitors who came by carriage from Natchez or Vicksburg, he was the epitome of Southern gentility. He was handsome, with a sharp jawline, silvering hair at his temples, and eyes the color of a stormy sky. He could speak of poetry and politics, of the price of cotton and the philosophies of ancient Rome. He would stand on his veranda, a glass of bourbon in hand, and speak of his plantation as a family, a place of order and productivity. But his family, his true family, was not the people he owned. It was the pack of 30 hounds he kept in the sprawling iron-gated kennels on the far side of the estate. They were not the typical foxhounds one saw on other plantations. Beaumont had bred them himself, a monstrous mix of Irish wolfhound for size, cane corso for power, and something else, something wild and ancient that gave them their unnerving silence and their eyes, which glowed with a pale, hungry light in the twilight. He called them his shadow pack, and he loved them with a terrifying proprietary passion. He fed them better than he fed his overseers, importing cuts of beef and having special meals prepared in the main house kitchen, a task that made the house servants tremble. The fear of the hounds was a constant low hum beneath the surface of daily life. At night their baying did not sound like normal dogs. It was a deeper, more mournful sound that seemed to pull at the very soul of the night. But it was the silence that was worse. When Master Beaumont walked the grounds, 2 of his favorites would trot at his heels, their massive paws making no sound on the dusty earth. They moved like wraiths, and the sight of them would cause field hands to freeze mid-swing, their hearts seizing in their chests. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, casting the cypress trees in long, skeletal shadows, a young man named Joseph failed to return from the fields. It was not unheard of. A man could collapse from the heat, could be bitten by a snake, could simply have his spirit broken and wander off into the swamp, choosing a swift end over a slow one. The overseer, a grim man named Finch, made a cursory search, his horse trotting along the edge of the cotton rows. But when he returned, he simply shook his head. That night, a new sound joined the symphony of the swamp. From the direction of the kennels came a frantic, excited yelping, a sound of frenzied energy that was quickly silenced. Then, a single long howl from Beaumont's prized hound, Cerberus, echoed across the plantation. It was not a mournful sound. It was a sound of satisfaction. In their cabin, Samuel lay on his straw pallet listening. Beside him, old Alara, a woman whose eyes held the history of 100 sorrows, began to hum a low, mournful spiritual. It was a song she hummed only when death was near. Samuel didn't ask. He didn't need to. He knew. The scent of fear in the air had grown stronger, and now it was mingled with the scent of something else, something final. Days turned into a week, and the name Joseph was spoken only in hushed tones, a ghost of a word that evaporated the moment it was uttered. Master Beaumont made no mention of the missing man. To him, Joseph was a tool that had broken and been discarded, a line item in a ledger, now crossed out. But the people of the quarters knew. They felt his absence like a missing tooth, a constant dull ache that served as a reminder of their own precarious existence. The heat of the Mississippi summer intensified, pressing down on Belle Reve until the very air seemed to shimmer. Work in the fields was brutal. The son was a merciless tyrant, and the overseer, Finch, was its eager disciple, his whip cracking like a punctuation mark to the unending misery. Samuel's hands were raw, his back a map of aches and pains. He focused on the rhythm of the work, the swing of the hoe, the pull of the cotton stalk. To think was to invite despair. One afternoon, while mending a broken fence line near the edge of the cypress swamp, Samuel saw him. Master Beaumont was riding his prize stallion Apollo, a magnificent black horse that moved with an arrogant grace. But it wasn't the master who held Samuel's attention. It was the two hounds, Brutus and Cassius, that loped alongside him. They were moving with that unnatural silence, their massive heads low to the ground. Beaumont reined in his horse not 20 yards from where Samuel worked. He dismounted, his fine leather boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. He produced a white handkerchief and patted his brow, his gaze sweeping across his domain. Samuel froze, making himself as small and insignificant as possible, hoping to blend in with the landscape. "Finch tells me the yield from this section is down," Beaumont said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. He wasn't speaking to Samuel, but to the world at large. "He speaks of laziness, of insolence." Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs. He kept his eyes fixed on the rotting fence post in his hands. Beaumont took a few steps closer, the hounds mirroring his every move. The air grew thick with their musky scent. "I do not tolerate laziness, boy," he said, his voice dropping to a conversational, almost pleasant tone that was far more terrifying than any shout. "Laziness is a disease. It weakens the stock. And I, above all things, value strong stock. In my horses, in my fields, in my hounds." He gestured with his riding crop toward the kennels, a dark shape barely visible through the trees. "My hounds are the pinnacle of breeding. Loyal, strong, efficient. They understand the natural order of things. The strong thrive and the weak are removed. It is the law of nature, is it not?" Samuel dared not answer. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple, stinging his eye. "Look at me when I speak to you," Beaumont commanded. The pleasantness was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp edge. Slowly Samuel raised his head. He met the master's gaze for a fleeting second before dropping his eyes to the man's boots. Beaumont's eyes were devoid of warmth, like chips of gray flint. But it was the hounds that truly chilled him. Their pale eyes were fixed on him, unblinking. There was no emotion in them, no anger or aggression. There was only a calm, patient hunger, a calculating intelligence that was profoundly unnatural. In that moment, Samuel understood. The hounds were not just pets, they were extensions of the master's will. They were his instruments. Beaumont seemed satisfied by Samuel's submission. He let out a small, quiet chuckle. "See that the fence is repaired by sundown. I want no weak links in my chain." He mounted Apollo and rode off, the hounds falling into their silent, loping stride beside him. Samuel remained frozen for a long time, the feel of their hungry eyes seared into his mind. He had not seen Joseph's end, but he had just looked into the eyes of the creatures that had delivered it. The whispers were true. The third rule of Bel Rev wasn't just a cautionary tale. It was a matter of life and death. Sarah was Samuel's solace. She was a house servant, her skin the color of rich coffee, and her hands, though often chapped from lye soap, were gentle. Her smile was a rare flower blooming in a barren wasteland, and for Samuel, it was the only thing that kept the despair at bay. They had known each other since they were children, their bond forged in the shared hardship of their existence. They couldn't have a marriage, not in the eyes of the law or the master, but in their hearts they were bound more tightly than any official ceremony could manage. They met in secret, in the brief moments between the end of the field work and the final lockdown of the quarters. Their spot was a small secluded clearing behind the smokehouse, shielded by a thicket of blackberry bushes. It was here they could speak freely, their voices low, their words precious. Tonight, Sarah was agitated. Her usually calm demeanor was fractured, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. "He was in the house today," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Master Beaumont, he was in a foul temper." said one of the silver serving spoons was missing. Samuel's gut clenched. A missing item, no matter how small, was a dangerous event. It was a disruption to the master's perfect order, and disruptions were always met with punishment. Who does he suspect? He looked at everyone, Sarah said, her voice trembling. But his eyes, they lingered on young Thomas. You know, the boy who helps in the stables. He's only 14. Samuel knew Thomas. A good-natured, slightly clumsy boy who was terrified of his own shadow. The idea of him stealing anything, let alone from the master, was absurd. It was a pretext, a reason. He had the hounds with him. Sarah continued, her voice barely audible. Cerberus and Hecate. He had them sniff the silver chest, then the boy's hands. It was a performance, a show for the overseer. Samuel reached out and took her hands. They were ice cold. Nothing will happen, Sarah. Thomas is a good worker. The spoon will turn up. But Sarah shook her head, pulling something from her pocket. It was a small silver locket, dented and tarnished with age. It was her most prized possession, a gift from her mother before she'd been sold downriver. I was polishing the silver this morning. I saw this on the floor near the dining room window. I think it fell off someone's dress. Samuel took the locket. It was cheap, not the kind of thing the master's wife or her guests would wear. He pried it open. Inside there was no picture, only a small, faded piece of paper. He couldn't read, but he recognized the scrawled, childish lettering. It belonged to the tutor who came twice a week to teach Beaumont's sickly son. She was a nervous young woman from a poor family up north. He's looking for an excuse, Samuel said, the grim realization settling in his stomach like a stone. The spoon is just a story. He doesn't care about the spoon. He looked from the locket to Sarah's terrified face. He cares about the hunt. Suddenly, a sound cut through the evening air. It was not the usual baying of the pack. It was a sharp, single bark from the kennels, followed by the clanging of a heavy iron gate. A signal. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. They're letting them out. Samuel's blood ran cold. He pulled Sarah deeper into the shadows of the smokehouse. Stay quiet, he breathed. From their hiding spot, they could see the main path leading from the great house toward the fields. A few moments later, two figures appeared. The overseer, Finch, on his horse, holding a lantern high, and beside him, Master Beaumont, walking with a calm, deliberate stride. He was not heading for the stables where Thomas slept. He was heading for the western fields, the ones that bordered the deep swamp, and at his heels, moving as one cohesive unit of shadow and muscle, was the entire pack. 30 silent hounds, their pale eyes glowing in the lantern light, their noses to the ground. They were not tracking a silver spoon. They were tracking a scent, the scent of a terrified 14-year-old boy. The night held its breath. The usual chorus of crickets and frogs fell silent, as if the swamp itself knew to be quiet, to bear witness to the horror that was about to unfold. From the smokehouse, Samuel and Sarah could only watch and listen. The lantern carried by Finch bobbed in the distance, a single malevolent firefly moving steadily toward the dark maw of the cypress grove. The hounds made no sound as they moved, a flowing river of darkness that was far more terrifying than any frenzied barking would have been. They were on the scent, their purpose absolute. Samuel knew young Thomas's terror as if it were his own. The boy would be running, his lungs burning, his bare feet stumbling over roots and sinking into mud. He would think he was running toward freedom, but all he was doing was participating in a game, Master Beaumont's favorite game. "We should go," Sarah whispered, her voice choked with tears. "If we're found here." Samuel knew she was right. Being out after curfew was a whipping offense. Being caught together was even worse. But his feet felt rooted to the spot, his senses strained, listening for the inevitable conclusion. He placed a steadying hand on her arm. "A moment more, then we go." For what felt like an eternity, the only sound was the frantic beating of his own heart. The lantern light disappeared into the dense woods. Then it began. A single terrified scream tore through the night. It was high-pitched, the sound of a boy's voice breaking with pure, undiluted panic. It was cut short, as if a hand had been clamped over his mouth. There was a moment of silence, and then the sound came. It was not a sound Samuel would ever be able to forget. It began with a low, guttural growling from the pack, a sound of shared, primal anticipation. Then came a sickening chorus of wet, tearing noises, punctuated by the sharp crack of something breaking. It was a symphony of destruction, an orchestra of nightmare. Above it all, a single gurgled cry of agony, a sound that was barely human, rose and was instantly swallowed by the frenzy. Sarah let out a muffled sob into her hands. Samuel pulled her tight against him, his own stomach churning. He shut his eyes, but the sounds painted a vivid, gruesome picture behind his eyelids. He imagined the silent, efficient brutality of the pack, the cold, observational stare of Master Beaumont, the impassive face of the overseer holding the lantern aloft to better illuminate the spectacle. The terrible noise lasted for only a few minutes, but it stretched into an eon of horror. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ceased. The silence that fell in its wake was heavier, more profound than before. It was a dead silence, thick with what had just happened. After a moment, a new sound emerged. It was the sharp, clear note of a whistle. Master Beaumont, calling his family home. Slowly, the bobbing light of the lantern reappeared from the trees. It moved back toward the great house at the same unhurried pace. Samuel could just make out the shapes of the hounds, trotting calmly now, their work done. There was no sign of Thomas. There was nothing left to see. Samuel finally found the strength to move. He gently guided Sarah back toward the dark cluster of cabins. They moved like ghosts, their feet making no sound on the path. No one else was outside. No lights burned in the windows. But Samuel knew that behind every shuttered window, people were awake. They were listening, just as he had. They were adding another layer to the thick blanket of fear that covered Belle Reve. When they reached her cabin, Sarah turned to him, her face a pale oval in the moonlight. The tears tracked clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "He's a monster," she whispered. "He's not a man. He's a monster." Samuel could only nod, the words stuck in his throat. He looked back toward the great white house, now dark except for a single lamp burning in Master Beaumont's study. A beautiful dream. He knew then that no one was safe. Not the young, not the old, not the strong, not the weak. They were all just pieces in the master's game, potential sport for his terrible pets. And the only way to win was not to play. The only way to win was to get away. The first impossible seed of escape had been planted in the blood-soaked soil of his mind. The morning after was always the worst. The sun would rise with an obscene cheerfulness, the birds would sing, and the dew would sparkle on the cotton leaves as if the world hadn't been permanently stained by the events of the night. The bell would ring at dawn, its clang a brutal summons back to reality. No one spoke of Thomas. His absence was a hole in the fabric of their community, a void everyone was forced to navigate around. The other stable hands did his work, their movements jerky and their eyes constantly scanning the shadows. Master Beaumont took his breakfast on the veranda, reading a newspaper from New Orleans as if nothing had occurred. He was calm, serene, his hunger sated. For Samuel, the world had shifted on its axis. The daily toil, once a simple burden, now felt like a countdown. Every crack of the whip, every cold glance from Finch, every distant bark from the kennels was a reminder that his life was not his own. It was merely on loan. The thought of escape, once a fleeting, desperate fantasy, began to take shape, solidifying from smoke into something hard and tangible. But the chains that held them to Belle Reve were not just the iron ones used for punishment. There were chains of geography, the miles of unforgiving swamp and dense forest that surrounded the plantation, a natural prison. There were chains of surveillance, the ever-watchful eyes of the overseer and the patrols that rode the perimeter day and night. And there were chains of the heart. Samuel looked at Sarah, her face etched with a new, permanent layer of fear, and knew he could never leave without her. He looked at old Ilara, whose weary wisdom had been a guidepost for him his whole life, and his resolve faltered. To run was to abandon those you left behind, to face the master's wrath. One evening, as Samuel sat outside his cabin, trying to carve a new handle for his axe, Ilara sat down beside him. She didn't speak for a long time. her hands busy mending a tattered piece of cloth. "The ground here is sour," she said finally, her voice low and raspy. "Soaked with too much sorrow. It poisons the roots." Samuel kept his eyes on the piece of wood in his hands, carefully shaving away a sliver. "The ground is the same as it's always been." "No," she said, her needle pausing. "It's worse. I've been on this land since before Beaumont's father bought it. I've seen cruel masters and I've seen indifferent ones. But this one is different. He doesn't just want our work. He savors our fear. It feeds him, like water feeds a plant." She looked toward the distant kennels. "His father feared the swamp, feared the night. This one, he has made a pact with it. He has bred the darkness right into those creatures of his." Samuel felt a shiver despite the heat. "They're just dogs, Ilara." "Are they?" she countered, her dark eyes pinning him. "Have you ever seen a dog move without a sound? Have you ever looked in a dog's eyes and seen a man's calculation looking back? No. They are his sin made flesh, and a man's sin will always, eventually come for him." Her words hung in the air, filled with a certainty that was both comforting and terrifying. She was speaking of prophecy, of a cosmic justice that felt impossibly distant to Samuel. He needed something more concrete. "How do you run from a shadow?" he asked, the question escaping him before he could stop it. Ilara's expression softened. She saw the desperation he was trying so hard to conceal. "You don't run from a shadow," she whispered, leaning closer. "You wait for the sun to be at its brightest, so the shadow is at its smallest. You find the light. Even a small candle can keep a large shadow at bay." She patted his hand, her touch as light as a dried leaf. "Be patient, Samuel. Be watchful. A man like that, full of so much pride, will eventually make a mistake. His chain is strong, but every chain has a weak link. You just have to be ready when it shows itself." Samuel looked down at the axe handle he was carving. It was smooth and strong in his grip. It was a tool for work, for building, for clearing the land. But as he held it, turning it over in his hands, he couldn't help but think that in the right circumstances, it could also be a weapon. Ilara's words had not offered him a map, but she had given him something just as valuable, a sliver of hope. He had to be patient, he had to be watchful, and he had to be ready. The weeks that followed were a study in tension. Samuel adopted a new persona. On the surface, he was the model worker, head down, compliant, efficient. But beneath that facade, his mind was a whirlwind of observation. He was no longer just a body moving through the day. He was a spy in his own life, gathering intelligence for a war no one else knew he was planning to wage. He learned the patrol schedules. 2 men, armed, circled the plantation's perimeter 3 times a night. Their path was predictable, but thorough. He noted the phases of the moon, realizing that the sliver of a new moon, when the nights were at their darkest, would be their only chance. He studied the swamp. On his rare moments of rest, he would gaze into its depths, tracing the paths of the egrets and herons. He knew there were hidden trails, old trapping lines, and half-submerged ridges that the patrol horses couldn't follow. But the swamp was also home to cottonmouths, alligators, and sucking mud that could swallow a man whole. It was a deadly gamble. Most importantly, he studied the hounds. He forced himself to watch them, to understand them. He saw how Beaumont trained them, using live animals, raccoons, possums, and once a stray dog that had wandered onto the property. The master didn't use commands of reward, only of release. He would work the pack into a controlled frenzy, then unleash them. The efficiency with which they worked was chilling. There was no wasted movement, no infighting, just a singular lethal purpose. One sweltering afternoon, Samuel was tasked with repairing a section of the roof on the main barn. It was high, hot work, but it afforded him a unique vantage point. From the peak of the roof, he could see most of the plantation laid out below him. The great house, the neat rows of cabins, the sprawling fields, and the dark square of the kennels. He was nailing down a shingle when he saw a carriage approaching on the main road. This was not unusual. Master Beaumont often entertained guests. But from his perch, Samuel saw something he wasn't meant to see. As the carriage drew near, Beaumont emerged onto his veranda. He was smiling, the picture of a gracious host, but just before his guests came into view, he gave a subtle, almost imperceptible hand signal toward the kennels. Samuel's eyes flickered to the kennels. An old, wizened servant named Silas, whose sole job was to care for the hounds, emerged from the stone building. He moved with a practiced slowness, unlatching the main gate. The hounds, however, did not emerge. They remained inside, silent. The gate was left open. The guests were a well-dressed man and his wife, come to discuss the purchase of cotton. Beaumont greeted them warmly, offering them drinks, guiding them to chairs on the veranda that faced away from the kennels, looking out over the picturesque fields. The entire time, Beaumont's demeanor was flawless. He laughed, he gestured, he was the perfect Southern gentleman. But Samuel, watching from above, could see the tension in the master's shoulders. He saw his eyes flick, just for a moment, toward the open kennel gate. It was a test, a drill. Beaumont was keeping his pack on a razor's edge of readiness, even with guests present. They were silent, unseen, but they were poised. A single word, a single whistle from their master, and they would pour from that gate like a tide of death. The realization struck Samuel with the force of a physical blow. The hounds were not just a tool of punishment. They were a system of absolute control. Their presence, even when unseen, was a constant threat that pinned everyone to their place. It wasn't the patrols or the swamps that were the biggest obstacle to escape. It was the 30 silent hunters who could be unleashed in an instant. He felt a wave of dizziness, whether from the heat or the terrifying clarity of his thoughts, he didn't know. He had been so focused on logistics, on paths and timing and moonlight, that he had underestimated the true nature of his enemy. He was not planning an escape from a farm. He was planning a prison break from a fortress guarded by monsters. And their warden was a man who hid his profound cruelty behind a mask of civilization. A man who could entertain guests while his instruments of death waited silently, just out of sight, for the signal to be let loose. The problem was far greater and far more complex than he had ever imagined. The cotton harvest was the cruelest time of year. The days were long, the sun relentless, and the quotas were impossibly high. Tempers frayed, and the overseer, Finch, seemed to take a grim pleasure in the heightened misery, his whip always ready. It was during this time that a man named Marcus reached his breaking point. Marcus was a giant of a man, quiet and proud, who had been at Belle Reve for less than a year, brought in a coffle from a failed estate in Virginia. He had not yet had the hope completely beaten out of him. He still carried the memory of a different life, and it made him brittle. The catalyst was simple, a lack of water. The water boy had been slow to make his rounds, and the hands were parched, their throats full of dust. When Finch rode by and saw Marcus leaning on his hoe for a moment to catch his breath, he reined in his horse. "You tired, Marcus?" Finch sneered, his voice dripping with false concern. Marcus didn't answer. He straightened up and stared out at the endless rows of white fluff. "I asked you a question, boy," Finch said, nudging his horse closer. Slowly, Marcus turned. His eyes were bloodshot, his face caked in sweat and dust. "We need water." His voice was a low rumble. Finch chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "You'll get water when I say you get water. You'll work until I say you stop. You seem to be confused about how things work here." He swung his leg over the saddle and dismounted, coiling his whip in his hand. The other field hands averted their eyes, their bodies tensing. Everyone knew what was coming. Samuel, working 2 rows over, felt his stomach clench. "Now," Finch said, walking toward Marcus, "you're going to apologize for your insolence, and then you're going to work twice as hard to make up for this little delay." Marcus stood his ground. He looked at the coiled whip, then at Finch's smug face, and then he did something no one had ever dared to do at Belle Reve. He said, "No." The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a thunderclap. The air crackled. Finch's face went from smug to purple with rage. "What did you say?" "I said no," Marcus repeated, his voice stronger this time. He took a half step forward. "We are men, not beasts of burden. We need water." Finch was so shocked by the open defiance that he was momentarily speechless. He uncoiled his whip. "You've just earned yourself a trip to the post." "I'm not going anywhere," Marcus said, and he balled his huge hands into fists. What happened next was a blur. Finch lunged, swinging the whip, but Marcus was ready. He ducked under the lash and surged forward, tackling the overseer around the waist. The two men went down in a cloud of dust, wrestling between the cotton plants. It was a desperate, clumsy fight. Marcus had the strength, but Finch had the fury of a man whose absolute authority had been challenged. The other hands were frozen in a state of shock and terror. To touch an overseer was a death sentence. They knew it. Marcus knew it. The fight ended when Finch managed to pull a small, heavy pistol from his belt. He brought the butt of it down hard on the side of Marcus's head. The big man grunted and slumped to the side, dazed. Finch scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily, his clothes askew. He kicked Marcus hard in the ribs. "Get him up!" he screamed, his voice shaking with rage. "Get him on his feet!" Two other hands, their faces masks of fear, reluctantly hauled Marcus up. He was conscious, but barely, a trickle of blood running from his temple. Finch didn't take him to the whipping post. Samuel watched, his heart sinking as the overseer dragged Marcus not toward the barn, but toward the great house. He was going to the master. He had sealed his own fate. Later that day, Master Beaumont himself rode out to the fields. He stopped the work, ordering everyone to gather. He sat calmly on his horse, Apollo, with Marcus standing before him, bound at the wrists. "There has been an incident," Beaumont said, his voice dangerously soft. "An act of aggression, an act of rebellion." He looked down at Marcus. "This tool has decided it knows better than its master. It has forgotten its purpose." He paused, letting his words sink in. The silence was absolute. "At Belrev, we do not tolerate faulty equipment. We do not tolerate weakness or dissent. We remove it." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply raised a small silver whistle to his lips. He blew a single piercing note. From the direction of the kennels, a sound answered, the clang of the iron gate. And then a silent, swift-moving tide of shadow and muscle poured into the field. The pack. They moved with a terrifying unity, their pale eyes fixed on the man standing before the master's horse. Marcus saw them coming. The dazed look in his eyes was replaced by a final, stark understanding. He closed his eyes, and for the first time that day, he looked truly broken. Master Beaumont did not unleash the hounds immediately. The lesson, he believed, was in the anticipation. He made the assembled workers watch as the pack fanned out, forming a silent, menacing semicircle around the bound figure of Marcus. The hounds didn't bark or snarl. They stood with their heads low, muscles coiled, their unnatural pale eyes fixed on their target. The only sound was the faint panting of 30 powerful sets of lungs and the thud of Marcus's knees as he collapsed in the dust. Samuel stood among the others, a prisoner to the scene. He wanted to look away, to shut his eyes, but he couldn't. He felt a morbid compulsion to bear witness, to burn this image into his memory as fuel for the fire of escape that now raged within him. He saw Sarah in the crowd of house servants who had been brought out to watch, her face ashen, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. "Every part of this plantation has a purpose," Beaumont announced from his saddle, his voice carrying over the silent field. "The cotton has a purpose. The horse has a purpose. You have a purpose. Your purpose is to work, to obey, to be productive. When a part ceases to serve its purpose, it is not only useless, it is a danger to the entire system." He gestured with his riding crop at Marcus. This one forgot his purpose. He thought he had a will of his own. He thought he could challenge the natural order of this place. He was wrong. The order is absolute. Beaumont looked from face to face, his cold gray eyes seeming to pierce each person individually. "Let this be a lesson to you all. This is the price of defiance. This is the fate of any who would seek to break the chain of command." He seemed to savor the moment, the collective wave of terror that rippled through the crowd. He was not just ending a life, he was reinforcing his power, stamping his authority onto the very souls of the people he owned. Then he dismounted. He walked calmly to Marcus, who was now weeping silently, his shoulders shaking. Beaumont reached down and, with a surprising gentleness, patted him on the shoulder. "You were a strong worker, Marcus," he said, his voice a low murmur that only those nearby could hear. "A waste of good muscle, but discipline must be maintained. He stepped back and looked at Cerberus, the massive, dark-furred leader of the pack. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was over in seconds. There was no chase, no hunt. It was a cold, calculated execution. Cerberus lunged, silent as a striking snake, and the rest of the pack followed in a blur of motion. The collective gasp from the crowd was drowned out by the terrible sounds that followed. This time, Samuel did not close his eyes. He watched. He saw the horrific efficiency of the pack. He saw the overseer, Finch, turn his head away, a flicker of something. Disgust? Fear? Crossing his face for a brief moment. But he saw Master Beaumont watch with a look of detached, almost scientific curiosity. He was not angry. He was not gleeful. He was merely observing the successful function of his chosen instruments. When it was done, the field was silent again. The hounds stood back, panting now, their muzzles stained. Beaumont produced his silver whistle and blew 2 short notes. As one, the pack turned and trotted back toward their kennels, their duty performed. Back to work, Beaumont said, his voice as calm as if he had just commented on the weather. He mounted his horse and rode toward the great house without a backward glance. Finch, his face pale, barked at the crowd. "You heard him! Back to work! Now!" No one moved for a moment. They were all in a state of shock, rooted to the spot where they had been forced to watch the unspeakable. Then, slowly, numbly, they shuffled back to the rows. Samuel picked up his hoe, his hands shaking. The cotton bolls, so white and pure, seemed to mock him. He looked down at the dark, disturbed patch of earth where Marcus had fallen. The lesson had been delivered, and Samuel had learned it well. He learned that Beaumont's cruelty was not born of passion or anger, but of a cold, rational philosophy. He was a farmer, and they were his crop, and he would not hesitate to cull any plant that did not grow according to his design. The thought of escape was no longer about finding a better life. It was about survival. It was the only choice left. In the wake of Marcus's public execution, a new and heavier silence fell over Belle Reve. It was the silence of utter subjugation. Hope, which had flickered in the form of Marcus's defiance, had been brutally extinguished. The workers moved like automatons, their eyes vacant, their spirits crushed under the weight of the master's lesson. Samuel felt the despair pressing in on him, threatening to suffocate his resolve. The image of what had happened in the cotton field was a constant presence in his mind. But alongside the horror, a cold, hard anger was beginning to crystallize. He found himself watching Master Beaumont not with fear, but with a detached, analytical hatred. He searched for a weakness, a flaw in the man's perfect armor of control. The flaw, when it appeared, was not what he expected. It came in the form of Beaumont's son, a pale, sickly boy of about 10 named Julian. Julian was rarely seen outside the great house. He suffered from a lung ailment that left him weak and perpetually short of breath. He was the one thing in Master Beaumont's world that was not strong, not perfect. One afternoon, Samuel was sent to the main house to repair a loose shutter on an upstairs window. From his ladder, he had a clear view of the back garden, a meticulously manicured space of rose bushes and stone benches. Julian was there, sitting on a bench, a book in his lap. His tutor, the nervous young woman from up north, sat with him. Master Beaumont came out onto the veranda. He watched his son for a moment, and Samuel saw an expression on his face he had never seen before, a mixture of frustration and something akin to disappointment. It was the look of a master breeder examining flawed stock. "Julian," Beaumont called out, his voice sharp. "Stand up straight. You slouch like a common field hand." The boy flinched and tried to straighten his frail shoulders. "We have guests arriving this evening. You will join us for dinner, you will make conversation, and you will not have one of your coughing fits. Do you understand me?" "Yes, father," Julian whispered, his voice barely carrying. Beaumont stared at him for another moment, then turned his attention to the tutor. "Has he been practicing his Latin?" "Yes, sir," the young woman stammered. "He struggles with the conjugations, but his vocabulary is improving." "Struggles?" Beaumont's voice was laced with contempt. "A Beaumont does not struggle. He conquers. See that he masters it." He turned and went back inside without another word. Samuel watched as Julian's shoulders slumped again. The boy looked down at his book, but he wasn't reading. A single tear rolled down his pale cheek. He was a prisoner in this place, just as surely as Samuel was. His cage was just gilded. Later that evening, the guests arrived. Samuel, his work finished, was walking back toward the quarters when he heard a commotion from the direction of the kennels. It was Beaumont's voice, raised in a rare display of fury. "Useless! Incompetent fool!" Samuel slipped behind a large oak tree, his curiosity overpowering his fear. He peered through the leaves. Master Beaumont had the old servant, Silas, by the collar. He was shaking the frail old man like a rag doll. One of the hounds, a female named Hecate, lay on the ground nearby, whining softly. "I pay you to keep them in prime condition," Beaumont roared. "Prime condition. And you let her eat something that sickens her? On the eve of a hunt I had planned?" "I don't know what it was, master," Silas pleaded, his voice thin with terror. "She must have found a rabbit or something in the yard." "You are responsible," Beaumont shoved Silas to the ground. "She is a finely tuned instrument, and you have treated her like a common cur. You will sit with her all night. You will not eat. You will not sleep. You will nurse her back to health. If she is not well by morning, your own rations will be given to the rest of the pack." He stormed off toward the house, his anger a palpable force. Silas slowly, painfully, picked himself up and went to the side of the whining hound, stroking her head and murmuring softly. Samuel slipped away, his mind racing. He had seen it, a crack in the master's cold, controlled facade. His perfect system was not so perfect. His rage was not for the well-being of the animal, but for the disruption to his plans, the imperfection in his collection. And the target of that rage was not one of the strong field hands, but the weakest, most vulnerable man on the plantation. But it was more than that. He had seen that Beaumont's obsession with strength and perfection was a kind of sickness. He was so fixated on his hounds, these symbols of predatory power, because he was terrified of the weakness he saw in his own bloodline, in his own son. The hounds were his legacy, not the frail boy in the big house. It was a small insight, a tiny chink in the armor, but for Samuel, it was everything. It made the monster for the first time seem fallible, and a fallible monster could perhaps be defeated. The key to any prison is knowledge. Samuel knew he had to learn more about the hounds, their routines, their weaknesses. His chance came in a most unexpected way. The hound Hecate did not recover quickly. For 2 days she remained listless, refusing food. Master Beaumont's foul mood cast a pall over the entire plantation. He canceled his planned hunt and stalked the grounds like a thundercloud. On the 3rd day, he sent for old Ilara. Her knowledge of herbs and roots was legendary on the plantation, a skill tolerated by the master only because a healthy workforce was a productive one. Samuel, who was repairing a water trough near the main house, saw Ilara walk slowly toward the kennels, a small bundle of dried leaves and roots in her hand. This was unheard of. The kennels were Silas's domain, and no one else was permitted inside. Samuel found a reason to be working on the far side of the barn, a spot that gave him a partial, hidden view of the kennel entrance. He watched as Ilara was admitted by a grim-faced Silas. She was in there for nearly an hour. When she emerged, her face was set like a stone mask. Samuel waited until she was well away from the house before he intercepted her on the path to the quarters. "Ilara," he said, his voice low. "Are you all right?" She looked at him, her old eyes seeming to see right through him. "I have been in the belly of the beast, child, and it smells of rot. The hound? The hound will live," she said dismissively. "It ate something foul in the swamp. I gave Silas a poultice to soothe its stomach, but it is not the dog that is sick. It is the man." She paused, looking around to ensure no one was listening. "He stood over me the entire time, watching my every move. He spoke to that dog with more tenderness than I ever heard him speak to a person. He calls them his children, his true heirs." Samuel felt a chill. "What did you see in there?" "I saw a fortress," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Stone floors, scrubbed clean. Each dog has its own stall. Their food is kept in a locked pantry. But I saw something else, Samuel. Something he does not know that I know." She leaned closer. The old man, Silas. His hands shake. His eyes are failing him. He is terrified of the master, but he loves those dogs in his own way. He talks to them, and he is careless. Careless how? Samuel pressed, his heart beginning to beat faster. The pantry, she whispered. Where the meat is kept. It is locked with a heavy iron key. Silas is meant to return it to the hook by the main gate as soon as he is done, but his mind wanders. Twice, while I was there, he left it on the preparation table. He is an old man with old habits. A key. A physical, tangible object. It was a small thing, but in Samuel's mind, it grew into something monumental. And something more, Ilara added, her grip tightening on his arm. The meat. It comes from the ice house once a week, but it is seasoned before it is given to them, with a special blend of powders from a jar the master keeps. He says it keeps their coats healthy and their senses sharp. She looked him dead in the eye. But a powder that sharpens can also be a powder that dulls. Any medicine in the wrong dose can become a poison. Samuel stared at her, the pieces clicking into place. A plan, audacious and terrifying, began to form in his mind. It was no longer just about running. It was about neutralizing the threat. It was about silencing the hounds. Ilara, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You've given me a candle. She gave him a rare small smile, her wrinkled face softening for a moment. Be careful, child, she said. Even a small candle can burn the whole house down. That night, Samuel did not sleep. He lay on his pallet, staring into the darkness, his mind ablaze. He had a path forward, a series of dangerous interlocking steps. He needed to get to the seasoning powder. He needed to find a way to administer it. And he needed Silas, the old forgetful keeper, to make a mistake. The risk was enormous. If he were caught, his fate would make Marcus's end look like a mercy. But for the first time since he had looked into the hungry eyes of the Shadow Pack, he felt a flicker not of hope, but of possibility. He had found a potential weak link in the master's chain. The next phase of Samuel's plan required him to get close to the great house, specifically to the kitchen and its adjacent pantries. This was Sarah's world, a place of polished silver and hushed voices, a world away from the dust and sweat of the fields. He needed her help, but the thought of involving her, of putting her in such immediate danger, filled him with a dread that was colder than any fear he had for himself. He met her that evening in their usual spot behind the smokehouse. The moon was a thin sliver, casting the world in shades of gray. He told her everything, Ilara's discovery, the key, the seasoning powder. He laid out the skeleton of his desperate plan. As she listened, her face grew paler. When he finished, she didn't speak for a long time. She just stared at him, her eyes wide with the enormity of what he was proposing. No, she said finally, her voice a fierce, trembling whisper. Samuel, no. It's too dangerous. If you're caught, they won't just... She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. What is the alternative, Sarah? He asked gently, taking her hands. To wait? To wait until it's your name he calls? Or my name? Or Ilara's? We saw what he did to Marcus. We heard what happened to Thomas. This isn't living. It's just waiting for our turn to die. But this is suicide, she pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. To go into his house, to steal from him. The hounds are the reason we have to do this, he insisted. We can't outrun them, not 30 of them. We have to stop them before we can even begin to run. Ilara is right. This is the only way. He could see the war in her eyes, the love for him battling with the paralyzing fear that governed their lives. He hated himself for asking this of her, for dragging her into his conspiracy. What do you need? She asked at last, her voice barely audible. Her surrender was not a sign of agreement, but of a deeper, more terrible understanding. She knew he was right. The powder, Samuel said. Ilara said it's a jar the master keeps himself. It must be near the kitchen or in the main pantry where he gives it to Silas. I need you to find it, and I need a small amount of it. How? She asked, her voice shaking. I'm watched every second I'm in that house. You're smart, Sarah. You know the rhythms of that place better than anyone. A moment when the cook is outside. A time when the family is in the parlor. That's all I need. A moment. She squeezed his hands, her decision made. The fear was still there, but beneath it was a new layer of steely resolve. All right, she whispered. I will do it. For 2 days, Samuel existed in a state of suspended animation. He went through the motions of his work, his body in the fields, but his mind in the great house with Sarah. Every time he saw one of the house servants, his heart leaped into his throat, expecting to hear the alarm, the cry of a thief caught in the act. But there was nothing. On the evening of the second day, she met him at the smokehouse. She looked exhausted, the strain showing in dark circles under her eyes. But she was calm. Without a word, she pressed a small, tightly wrapped cloth packet into his hand. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. It was in his study, she whispered, her words coming in a rush. Connected to the pantry. He keeps it in a locked spice cabinet. He calls it his proprietary blend. I had to pick the lock with a sewing needle. I only had a minute while they were all on the veranda. I took just a handful. Samuel carefully opened a corner of the cloth. The powder inside was a dark, earthy color, a mix of gray and brown, and it had a strange metallic smell, like dried blood and bitter herbs. The serpent's powder. The key to everything. Sarah, he said, his voice thick with gratitude and fear. You are the bravest person I have ever known. No, she said, looking away toward the dark shape of the great house. I'm just the most terrified. She looked back at him, her eyes pleading. Promise me, Samuel. Promise me you will be careful. I promise, he said, tucking the precious packet into the waistband of his trousers. He held her close, the familiar scent of lye soap and wood smoke a small comfort in a world gone mad. He had the first piece of his puzzle. Now came the next, even more dangerous part, getting it to the Hounds. And for that, he needed the help of the forgetful old man, Silas. Silas was a creature of habit. His life revolved around the rhythms of the Hounds and the whims of Master Beaumont. Samuel began to study these rhythms with an obsessive focus. He learned that Silas fed the pack twice a day, once just after dawn, and again as the sun began to set. The evening meal was the larger one, the one meant to keep the Hounds sated through the night. The preparation was always the same. Silas would go to the ice house to retrieve the meat. He would then go to the kennel's preparation room, a small stone annex with a thick wooden table and a water pump. He would chop the meat, mix in the master's special powder, and then distribute it into 30 heavy ceramic bowls. This ritual took him the better part of an hour. Samuel's plan was to intercept this process. He couldn't just add his own doctored powder. Silas might notice the difference in quantity. He had to swap it. He needed a substitute for Beaumont's powder, something that looked and felt similar. He found it in the form of finely crushed river clay and charcoal from the blacksmith's forge, mixed with a little dry dust. It was a crude imitation, but in the dim light of the kennel's prep room, he hoped it would be enough. He chose his night carefully, waiting for the dark of the new moon. He told Sarah his plan in hushed tones, telling her to be ready, to have a small bundle of food and a gourd of water prepared. The fear in her eyes was a physical pain for him, but they both knew there was no turning back. As dusk began to settle, Samuel made his move. He slipped away from the quarters using the long shadows of the outbuildings as cover. He carried 2 packets, one with Sarah's stolen powder and one with his own worthless imitation. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. Every snapping twig, every hoot of an owl, sounded like an alarm. He reached the blind side of the kennels and waited. He could hear Silas moving about inside the prep room, the rhythmic thud of a cleaver hitting the wooden block. Through a grimy window, he saw the old man's stooped silhouette. Now came the gamble. Everything depended on Silas's carelessness. Samuel waited. The chopping stopped. He saw Silas wipe his brow and shuffle toward the main kennel building to slop out the water troughs before feeding. This was his moment. Silas had left the prep room door unlatched. Samuel slid from the shadows, his movements swift and silent. He slipped into the prep room. The air was thick with the smell of raw meat and the musky scent of the Hounds. On the table was a large wooden bowl containing the master's powder. Beside it, the piles of freshly chopped meat. And there, lying on the edge of the table, was the heavy iron key to the pantry. Ilara had been right. With trembling hands, Samuel performed the swap. He scooped the master's potent powder into his cloth and replaced it with his own mixture of clay and charcoal. He then took a handful of the real powder and began to sprinkle it liberally over the portions of meat, working it in with his fingers, his gorge rising at the bloody task. He knew he was delivering a sleeping draught, not a fatal one. He and Ilara had agreed on the dosage, enough to induce a deep, unnatural slumber for many hours, but not to end them. He was not a murderer. He only wanted a chance. He heard a sound from the main kennel. Silas was finishing with the water. Panicked, Samuel looked around. He had tainted the food, but his work wasn't done. He had to ensure they couldn't be roused. He snatched the iron key from the table. As an afterthought, he also grabbed the cleaver Silas had been using, its weight heavy and cold in his hand. He slipped back out the door just as Silas shuffled back in. Samuel pressed himself into the deepest shadows, his breath held tight in his chest. He watched as the old man, completely oblivious, began to mix the fake powder into the meat and portion it into the bowls. The first part of the plan was done. He had the key, he had the cleaver, and the hounds were about to eat their last drugged meal. Now he just had to wait for the silence. The deep, unnatural silence that would tell him the guardians of Bel Rev were asleep. The waiting was the purest form of torture. Samuel retreated to the shadows of the blacksmith's shop, a place where he could watch the kennels without being easily seen. The sun sank completely below the horizon, and the plantation was plunged into the profound darkness of a moonless night. He saw the faint yellow glow of a lantern as Silas finished his work, the clatter of ceramic bowls, and then the low, eager growling of the pack as they were fed. Then, silence. Samuel counted the minutes, his own heartbeat a frantic metronome. 1 hour passed, then another. He had to be sure. He had to wait until the powder had done its work completely. He thought of Sarah, waiting in her cabin, her own fear a mirror of his. He thought of Ilara, likely humming one of her mournful spirituals, praying for them. Around what he judged to be midnight, he knew he could wait no longer. The night was as still as a tomb. There was no baying, no restless movement from the kennels. It was time. Clutching the heavy iron key in the cleaver, he moved like a phantom across the open ground. The main gate to the kennel yard was barred, but the lock was a simple iron pin, and he slipped it open with a faint scrape of metal on metal. He stepped inside. The yard was filled with the sleeping forms of the hounds. They were sprawled in the dust, on their sides, their breathing slow and unnaturally deep. They looked like statues in the starlight. For a moment he was struck by their strange beauty, their coiled power now dormant. He stepped carefully over a massive hound, its flank rising and falling almost imperceptibly. The silence was absolute. The powder had worked. He moved to the main building where the individual stalls were. He used the key he'd taken from Silas to open the heavy door. Inside, the alpha, Cerberus, was in the first stall. He was a terrifying beast, even in sleep. Samuel's hand tightened on the cleaver. A voice in his head, a voice that sounded like Master Beaumont, told him to finish it, to remove the threat permanently. But he couldn't. He backed away. His goal was not slaughter, it was freedom. He moved down the line of stalls, opening each and every latch. Then he went back to the main kennel gate and opened it wide. If the hounds did wake, he wanted them scattered, confused, their pack unity broken. His work here was done. He slipped back out into the night, leaving the kennels open and their fearsome guardians lost in a drugged slumber. He moved quickly now, his destination, the cabins. He reached Sarah's door and gave the soft, prearranged signal, 3 light taps, like a woodpecker. The door creaked open instantly. She was there, a small bundle in her hands, her face a pale question in the dark. "It's done," he whispered. "They're asleep. We have to go now." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She slipped out and took his hand. They did not look back at the great house. They turned their faces toward the one place that offered any hope of concealment, the swamp. They moved past the silent cabins, past the edge of the cotton fields where Marcus had met his end. The air was thick with the smell of jasmine and decay. As they reached the tree line, the true edge of their world, Samuel paused and looked back one last time at the plantation of Bel Rev. The great house was dark, its master asleep, unaware that his entire system of control had just been dismantled. For the first time in his life, Samuel felt something other than fear. It was a fierce, wild thing, a feeling of possibility. They were running into a world of unknown dangers, but they were running on their own terms. He squeezed Sarah's hand. "Ready?" he whispered. "Ready," she replied, her voice firm. Together they stepped off the soil of the plantation and into the deep, waiting darkness of the cypress swamp. Master Tiberius Beaumont awoke to a world that was wrong. The first sign was the silence. He was accustomed to waking just before dawn to the sound of the pack stirring, a low rumble of anticipation for their morning run. Today, there was nothing. An unnerving stillness hung over Bel Rev. He dressed quickly, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He strode out onto his veranda, his eyes immediately going to the kennels. The main gate was ajar, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. A cold fury, colder and more potent than any hot-tempered rage, washed over him. He did not shout. He did not run. He walked with a calm, murderous deliberation toward the kennels, his silver-knobbed cane striking the ground with a sharp, rhythmic tap. He found Silas first, asleep on a stool just inside the prep room, an empty bottle of corn liquor on the floor beside him. Beaumont didn't even bother to wake him. He stepped over the old man and into the kennel yard. What he saw made his blood run cold. His hounds, his perfect, beautiful instruments of terror, were scattered across the yard like discarded toys. Some were still in a deep, unnatural sleep. Others were beginning to stir, stumbling to their feet, whining and disoriented. They were groggy, sick, their predatory edge completely gone. He saw the opened stall doors, the empty feeding bowls. He knelt and sniffed one of the bowls, the faint, bitter scent of the herbs Alara used for sleep remedies. He understood instantly. It was not an accident. It was an attack, a coordinated, deliberate assault on the very heart of his power. His fury now had a focus. He turned and strode toward the quarters, his face a mask of stone. He did not need the overseer. He did not need a bell. His presence was enough. Doors opened and people peeked out, their faces full of fear as they saw the master, alone and radiating a silent, terrifying rage. "Where is Samuel?" he demanded, his voice low and carrying in the morning air. "Where's the girl, Sarah?" No one answered. Eyes darted from side to side. Then he saw her. Old Alara standing in the doorway of her cabin, her face impassive. She was not looking at him with fear. She was looking at him with something that resembled pity. And he knew. She was involved. They were all involved. His entire family had conspired against him. At that moment, the overseer, Finch, rode up, his face pale. "Master Beaumont, 2 are missing. Samuel and the girl, Sarah, and the kennel." "I am aware." Beaumont cut him off, his voice like ice. He looked at the faces before him, the people he had considered less than human, and saw the flickering embers of rebellion in their downcast eyes. The lesson of Marcus had not worked. It had only hardened them. "Finch," Beaumont commanded, turning his attention to the swamp. "Gather every man you have. Arm them. I want a perimeter set from the river to the old logging road. No one gets through." "But the hounds, sir?" Finch asked, his voice trembling slightly. "They're in no condition to track." Beaumont's lips curled into a snarl. For the first time, his composure cracked. "Then we will be the hounds," he roared, his voice echoing across the plantation. "They have taken something from me. They have challenged my authority on my own land. They will not escape. I will hunt them down myself. And when I find them, I will make what happened to Marcus in the field look like a child's bedtime story." He pointed a shaking finger at Ilara. "And you. You will be locked in the hot box. We will see how your spirit holds up after a day in the sun without water. The rest of you will work until you collapse. There will be no rest and no rations until they are found." He spun on his heel and strode back toward the great house to retrieve his finest rifle. The hunt was on, but it was no longer a game. It was not a lesson. It was a war for control, for vengeance. The beautiful dream of Bel Rev had been shattered, and in its place was only the master's burning, all-consuming need to reclaim what he had lost. The swamp had taken his fugitives, and he would tear the swamp apart to get them back. The swamp was a world unto itself, a labyrinth of black water, cypress knees, and hanging moss that clawed at them like ghostly fingers. For 2 days Samuel and Sarah pushed through it, guided by the sun and the faint intuitive knowledge of the land that Samuel possessed. They were fueled by fear and the small store of dried meat and cornbread Sarah had managed to bring. The air was thick and wet, buzzing with insects. Snakes slid from their path, and the unseen splashes of larger creatures in the dark water kept their nerves on edge. But here, in this primal, dangerous world, they were free. The fear they felt was a natural fear of the wilderness, not the twisted psychological terror of Master Beaumont. On the 3rd day, they reached a canebrake, a dense, towering forest of river cane so thick it blotted out the sun. Samuel knew from the stories of old fishermen that this canebrake stretched for miles and eventually met the banks of a tributary that flowed into the Mississippi. It was their best hope. As they rested, catching their breath, they heard it. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, was the sound of men shouting, and then a single gunshot, flat and dead in the humid air. "They're looking for us," Sarah breathed, her eyes wide with terror. "They won't follow us in here," Samuel said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "The horses can't get through. They'll have to come on foot." He pulled her deeper into the cane, the thick stalks closing behind them like a curtain. They moved for another hour, the sounds of the pursuit fading, replaced by the rustle of the cane and their own ragged breathing. They finally broke through the edge of the canebrake and saw it. A muddy, slow-moving river. Freedom. On the far bank was a dense, unfamiliar forest. It was another world, a place untouched by the stain of Bel Rev. They found a half-rotted log and, using it for support, began to push their way across the murky water. They were halfway across when they heard a new sound, one that froze the blood in their veins. It was the baying of a hound, a single, powerful voice. Samuel looked back in horror. There, on the bank they had just left, stood Master Beaumont. He was alone, his fine clothes torn and muddied. He looked wild, his face contorted with a terrible, obsessive fury. And at his side, on a leash, was Cerberus. The great hound looked weak, but it had its nose to the ground, and it was pulling its master forward, its voice raised in a cry of discovery. Beaumont had brought his alpha, his favorite son, to finish the hunt himself. "You cannot escape me," Beaumont screamed across the water, his voice cracking with rage. "This is my land. You are my property. You will never be free." He raised his rifle. The setting sun glinted off the long barrel. Samuel didn't think. He shoved Sarah forward toward the far bank. "Go, keep going." He turned in the water, the log between him and his former master. He held the cold, heavy weight of the cleaver he had carried all this way. He would not die running. Beaumont leveled the rifle. The world seemed to slow down. Samuel saw the flash, heard the deafening crack, and felt a searing pain rip through his shoulder. He cried out, losing his grip on the log and sinking into the brown water. He came up sputtering, his arm a blaze of agony. But he was alive. In his rage and exhaustion, Beaumont's aim had been off. On the bank the master cursed, fumbling to reload. Cerberus, driven by the scent of blood and the frenzy of the hunt, lunged forward, pulling the leash from Beaumont's grasp. The great hound hit the water with a huge splash and began to paddle furiously toward Samuel. Samuel, treading water with one good arm, raised the cleaver. The hound was a force of nature, a killing machine closing the distance with terrifying speed. But as it lunged, its jaws open, Samuel saw its eyes. And for the first time, he didn't see cold calculation. He saw a simple, primal hunger, clouded by the lingering effects of the drug. It was just an animal. He brought the cleaver down with all the strength he had left. It was a clumsy, desperate blow, but it found its mark. The great hound yelped, a sound of pain and surprise, and fell back. Beaumont, on the shore, let out a cry of pure anguish, as if the blow had struck him. "Cerberus!" In that moment of distraction, as the master stared in horror at his wounded hound, Sarah reached the far bank. She scrambled up the muddy slope and disappeared into the trees. She was safe. Samuel, his duty done, let the current take him. He floated downstream, his vision blurring, the sounds of Beaumont's enraged and grief-stricken screams fading behind him. He did not die. He was found miles downriver by a Quaker family running a station on the Underground Railroad, who patched his wound and hid him until he was strong enough to travel. He never saw Belle Reve again. He eventually found Sarah, after months of searching, in a freedmen's community north of the Ohio River. The story of what happened back at the plantation became a whispered legend. They said Master Beaumont lost his mind after that day. He neglected the fields, the great house fell into disrepair, and he spent all his time with his remaining hounds, a broken man haunted by the ghost of his favorite. The beautiful dream had rotted from the inside out. Samuel and Sarah lived a long life, a free life, but on still, moonless nights when the wind rustled through the trees, Samuel would sometimes wake in a cold sweat, his shoulder aching, and in the dark silence of his memory, he could almost hear the faint, mournful echo of a hound baying, far, far away in the swamps of Mississippi.